My name is Philip Montgomery. I'm 38 years old as I record this, a husband, a father to one quietly observant 8-year-old boy, and until recently, the senior operations coordinator for a mid-sized logistics firm in the Midwest. If you met me at work, you probably wouldn't remember much about me. I wasn't the loud one in meetings. I wasn't the charismatic closer. I wasn't the executive with the corner office or the rising star with polished LinkedIn posts about disruption and vision. I was the one people CC'd when something broke. The one who just handled it. The one who stayed late without announcing it. The one who knew which vendor would actually pick up the phone at 6:12 p.m. on a Friday. Most people saw me as steady, reliable, mild. Some mistook that for small. I built my career on being useful, on anticipating problems before they become crises, on absorbing friction so that other departments could look smooth and efficient. And for a long time, I believed that was enough, that if you protected the system would eventually protect you. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing corruption or delivering some dramatic speech that leaves a boardroom in stunned silence. There are no villains here with evil grins. No dramatic music swelling as I flip a table and storm out. It's quieter than that. It's about what happens when a man realizes he has been holding up more than anyone knows. When he understands that his silence has become structural. When he sees clearly that the stability everyone depends on isn't policy or leadership. It's him. And then, one day he chooses to stop. Not to punish, not to humiliate, not to teach them a lesson, but to stop shielding a system that has depended on his unpaid loyalty and unspoken sacrifices. When I resigned, I did it at the last possible moment. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but precisely, legally, calmly. I left at a point when my departure wouldn't just be inconvenient. It would bring operations to a standstill, and the disruption that followed. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge. It was the natural consequence of years of neglect. This is a story about invisibility, about the normalization of disrespect, about the slow erosion of value when competence becomes expected but never acknowledged. It's also a story about leverage, about documentation, about preparation, about choosing dignity over comfort. There were many moments when I could have spoken louder, many opportunities to confront. Many times I almost exploded, but that's not who I am. Instead, I observed, I learned, I prepared. And when I finally moved, I did it in silence. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through how it happened. Not the dramatic version, the real one, the gradual one, the kind most people live but rarely articulate. If you've ever felt essential but unseen, valuable but replaceable, loyal but quietly exhausted, you might recognize something in this. Let me ask you something gently before we begin. Have you ever realized that the only reason something functions is because you haven't stepped away yet? And to them, I was solid. That was the word. Not brilliant, not strategic, not leadership material. Solid. If a shipment was misrouted, someone would say, "Get Philip on it." If a vendor missed a deadline, Philip will figure it out. If payroll data didn't reconcile with dispatch logs, loop Philip in. I was the quiet middle layer between chaos and competence. In meetings, I rarely spoke first. Not because I didn't have opinions, but because I was calculating impact. I'd wait while managers debated optics, while sales defended promises that operations would somehow have to absorb, while executives talked about growth curves without understanding the friction underneath. Then someone would look at me, "Phil, is that doable?" And I would answer carefully, not politically, factually. "Yes, if we reroute through Dayton and extend dock hours." "No, unless we renegotiate the carrier penalties. Only if we push the maintenance window." I never dramatized constraints. I translated reality. That was my value. But over time, something subtle formed around me. A role that no one announced, but everyone reinforced. I became the man who would absorb impact quietly. When deadlines were unrealistic, I stayed late instead of pushing back hard. When communication failed between departments, I corrected it without naming the source. When leadership made public promises that strained the infrastructure, I adjusted schedules instead of exposing fragility. I told myself it was professionalism. That maturity meant you solved problems instead of pointing fingers. And for years, it worked. My performance reviews were glowing, indispensable, reliable under pressure, team player. I received modest bonuses, occasional thank you emails, handshakes in hallways. But I also noticed something else. Promotions went to louder men, men who spoke in confident generalities, men who delegated responsibility but retained visibility, men who didn't know the system but knew how to narrate it. Oh, I trained two of them. One of them once asked me how to read the dispatch exception report. He now manages a team of 22. I never resented them personally. That's important. What I felt was more subtle, a slow recognition that I was being categorized, useful, technically strong, operational, not strategic. And once you're placed in that box, the ceiling lowers quietly. No one says, "You'll never lead." They say, "You're too valuable where you are." It sounds like praise. It feels like a cage. There was also the way decisions were framed around me. Phil doesn't mind. Phil will handle it. Phil's good with the details. No one asked whether Phil wanted to keep carrying structural weight without authority. They assumed my silence meant consent. But my silence was calculated. At home, my wife would sometimes ask, "Why don't you push back more?" I'd shrug. It's not worth the politics. What I didn't say was this. I believe stability depended on me staying steady. That if I disrupted the balance, things might crack, and I would be blamed for the fracture. So I stayed predictable. I arrived early. I left late. I answered calls on weekends. I memorized vendor escalation chains no one else bothered to learn. I became the bridge no one noticed because it never collapsed. And that invisibility, it was subtle. No insults, no shouting, no humiliation. Just a gradual assumption that I would always be there. Always flexible, always loyal, always silent. They saw me as dependable infrastructure, not as a man with thresholds, not as someone who could choose to stop. And I didn't correct them, not yet. If you ask most people when things started going wrong, they'll point to a dramatic moment, a confrontation, a betrayal, a public humiliation. For me, it was smaller than that. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, quarterly planning meeting, conference room B, the one with the glass wall that made everything feel performative. We were reviewing a new regional expansion initiative. Sales had landed a promising contract with a retail chain that wanted aggressive delivery timelines. Leadership was excited. Growth slides, forecast projections. Words like scalable and momentum floated around the table. I had already run the numbers. The warehouse staffing wasn't ready. The routing software wasn't calibrated for the additional volume. Our two most reliable carriers were operating near max capacity. When the presentation ended, our director of operations turned to me. "Phil, we're good operationally, right?" There it was again. Not what do you see? Not what risks should we consider? Just confirmation. I answered honestly. "We can make it work," I said, "but not at the current timeline, without either adding temporary labor or renegotiating dock windows. If we push as is, delays will compound by week 3. Silence. Then the VP of sales leaned back in his chair. "Phil always sees the bottlenecks," he said with a smile. "That's why we keep him around." Laughter. It wasn't cruel laughter. It wasn't mocking. But something in the phrasing caught me. "That's why we keep him around." Not, "That's why we value him." Not, "That's why his input matters." It was the tone you'd use for a specialized tool. Reliable, practical, replaceable. I felt this just slightly, like a paper cut you don't notice until later. The conversation moved on quickly. The timeline remained aggressive. No additional labor was approved. No schedule adjustment was made. After the meeting, the director stopped me in the hallway. "Don't worry, Phil. We'll figure it out." I nodded. "I know," I said. But what he meant was, "You'll figure it out." 3 weeks later, the delays began exactly as projected. Dock congestion, missed pickups, escalation emails from the client. I worked through it. Rebuilt dispatch matrices. Called vendors personally. Stayed until midnight twice in 1 week to stabilize the outbound flow. No one publicly connected the correction to the earlier warning. In the next meeting, the VP of sales said, "Glad we got that sorted." Sorted. As if it resolved itself. No acknowledgement, no correction to the narrative. And that's when I understood something important. The first small cut wasn't the comment. It was the erasure. When you consistently identify risk and then quietly absorb the consequences of being ignored, your accuracy becomes invisible. It becomes assumed, predictable. I told myself it didn't matter. That recognition wasn't the point. That stability was the point. That grown professionals don't need applause. But something subtle shifted inside me. I began noticing patterns, ideas reframed without attribution, problems assigned without discussion. Success is described in collective language. Failure is described in operational language, which meant me. Still, I didn't react. I didn't confront the VP about the comment. I didn't request public acknowledgement. I didn't escalate concerns about timeline decisions. Instead, I did what I always did. I opened my black leather notebook and I wrote the date. I documented the forecast I'd given. The resource request was declined. The projected impact window. The actual disruption window. Not for revenge, for clarity. At the time, I wouldn't have said I was preparing for anything. I just needed a private record of reality, because when narratives start to drift, and you are the quiet one in the room, it's easy to start doubting your own perception. Was that comment dismissive? Was that oversight intentional? Am I overthinking this? Documentation is grounding. Facts don't gaslight you. That Tuesday wasn't explosive. No shouting, no dramatic turning point. Just a sentence, a laugh, a reframing, a small cut, the kind that heals on the surface, but stays tender underneath. And once you feel it, you start noticing every similar one that follows. The thing about small cuts is this. You can pretend they're accidents. The first time someone interrupts you mid-sentence, it's just enthusiasm. The first time your idea is repeated louder by someone else and credited to them, it's a coincidence. The first time your workload expands without a title adjustment, it's temporary. But when it becomes patterned and you're the only one adjusting, something deeper is happening. And I was adjusting constantly. After the expansion project stabilized, leadership praised the team's resilience. There was a catered lunch, a short speech about cross-department collaboration. I stood in the back, plate in hand, listening to executives thank managers for navigating complexity. No one mentioned the midnight vendor calls. No one mentioned the emergency rerouting maps I built. No one mentioned the weekend I spent rewriting the doc allocation protocol. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I clapped with everyone else, because by then I had internalized the logic. If the system succeeds, we all succeed. If the system struggles, operations absorbs it. That's professionalism. I told myself recognition was ego. I told myself stability was reward enough. I told myself mature men don't need validation. But normalization is dangerous, because once people adjust to your elasticity, they stop seeing it as flexibility and start seeing it as baseline. More requests came without context. Phil, can you review this? Phil, can you stay on this until it's fixed? Phil, we promised the client a workaround. You'll find one, right? Right. No additional headcount, no formal authority, no shift in compensation. Just trust in my willingness to compensate for structural gaps. And I did, at least at first. I rationalized it as strategic patience. I thought when leadership sees sustained excellence, they'll elevate it. When they recognize consistency, they'll formalize influence. But influence without visibility is just labor. One afternoon, about 6 months after that September meeting, we had a leadership restructuring announcement. 2 new managerial roles were created. I wasn't surprised when my name wasn't on the list. What surprised me was who was. One was a former sales analyst I had trained on supply chain basics. The other was a project coordinator who often came to me privately to interpret system data. Both competent, both confident, both louder. After the announcement, the director called me into his office. "I hope you understand," he began, hands folded. "You're critical where you are." There it was again. "You're too important to move." It sounded like affirmation, but I heard the translation. "You stabilize what others disrupt. If we move you, the machine shakes." And I asked him something I'd never asked before. What would I need to demonstrate to be considered for that level? He paused. Not long, but long enough. "Well," he said carefully, "visibility, strategic presence. You're excellent operationally. Leadership needs broader exposure." Broader exposure. I nodded slowly. After leaving his office, I sat in my car for 10 minutes before driving home. Not angry, just clear. They didn't see disrespect. They saw optimization. From their perspective, this made sense. Put the visible communicators in leadership. Keep the system stabilizer where it stabilizes best. No malice, just misalignment. But here's what normalization does. It convinces you that your ceiling is rational, that your confinement is practical, that your silence is maturity. So I adjusted again. I began speaking slightly more in meetings. Not emotionally, just factually, but with framing. I started sending follow-up summaries after discussions, outlining risks and projections in writing. I volunteered once to present an operational overview at the quarterly review. The feedback afterward, great detail, Phil. You're so thorough. Exactly why we need you in the weeds. The weeds, I smiled, and something inside me stopped arguing. Not externally, internally. I stopped believing that louder performance would change perception, because I was already categorized. Reliable, technical, ground level, invisible in leadership narratives. And the most dangerous part, I had helped build that perception by absorbing, by correcting quietly, by choosing harmony over friction. Every time I shielded the system from consequences, I reinforced the belief that consequences were manageable. Every time I fixed something privately, I reduced urgency publicly. I had become the insulation. And insulation by design is unseen. That realization didn't explode. It settled. A slow, steady recognition that the role they assigned me wasn't malicious. It was convenient. And convenience is rarely questioned, especially when the person carrying it never complains. No one ever formally told me what my role was supposed to be. My job description said Senior Operations Coordinator. It listed oversight responsibilities, cross-department collaboration, performance metrics, and vendor management. But that wasn't the real role. The real role was unspoken. I was the buffer, the absorber, the translator, the stabilizer between ambition and infrastructure. And once I saw that clearly, I started noticing how consistently it showed up. Sales would promise aggressive timelines to secure contracts. Leadership would announce efficiency targets without adjusting headcount. Finance would trim budgets, assuming operational elasticity. And every time pressure built, it flowed in one direction. Down, toward operations. Toward me. Not because I was the lowest ranking. I wasn't. But because I was the safest landing point. I didn't escalate. I didn't embarrass. I didn't publicly correct. I quietly recalibrated. If a commitment was unrealistic, I found the hidden capacity. If a workflow was flawed, I rewrote the steps. If communication broke down, I mediated without exposing fault lines. I thought that made me mature. What it actually made me was predictable. There's a subtle shift that happens when someone becomes predictable under pressure. People stop checking on whether it's fair. They stop asking if it's sustainable. They start assuming it's infinite. I remember a specific moment that crystallized it. We had just completed another intense quarter. Volume was up. Margins were tight. Turnover in the warehouse had increased because of burnout. During a leadership sync, the director said casually, "Operations held it together again." Thanks, Phil. It was meant kindly, but then he added, "That's why we don't need to overcomplicate things. We've got steady hands." Steady hands. I sat there realizing something uncomfortable. My steadiness was being used as justification, not to improve the system. If I kept compensating, they didn't have to restructure. If I kept absorbing strain, they didn't have to acknowledge fragility. My reliability was masking systemic weakness. And here's the part I had to admit to myself. I liked being the steady one. There's pride in being indispensable. There's identity in being the person everyone relies on. It feels strong. It feels competent. But it's also dangerous, because indispensability without authority is dependency in disguise. They depended on me, but I didn't have leverage. I didn't control budget decisions. I didn't set a strategic direction. I didn't influence hiring approvals. I just made other people's decisions survivable. And the more I did it, the more it became my role. When new managers were onboarded, they were told, "Phil knows how everything connects." When cross-department confusion arose, they were told, "Ask Phil." When executive presentations needed clean data, they were told, "Have Phil validate it." But when strategy meetings happened at higher levels, I wasn't invited, not out of exclusion, out of categorization. He's operational, he handles execution. And execution, in corporate language, is downstream from vision. It took me a long time to see the quiet irony. I understood the system more comprehensively than most of the people shaping it. But understanding without voice is just labor. and voice without leverage is performance. One evening after everyone had left, I stood on the warehouse floor overlooking the loading bays. The hum of forklifts had faded. The space felt calm. I realized something simple and unsettling. If I disappeared tomorrow, the org chart would remain intact. Titles wouldn't change. Departments wouldn't dissolve. But the connections between them, those would strain, because I wasn't a box on the chart. I was the glue between boxes. And glue isn't celebrated, it's assumed. That night, for the first time, I didn't feel pride in being the steady one. I felt tired, not physically, structurally. Tired of being the silent reinforcement that allowed everyone else to appear decisive. That was the role I had been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible. And I had played it perfectly. There wasn't a confrontation. No argument, no public slight, no dramatic final straw. The shift happened on a quiet Thursday evening in early spring. It had been a long week. A systems update had partially failed on Monday, causing reporting discrepancies between dispatch and billing. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to create confusion, finger-pointing, and urgent Slack threads that multiplied by the hour. By Wednesday, I had identified the root issue, an overlooked API timeout parameter after the update. It was minor, technical, and fixable. But the ripple effects were real. I drafted a clear explanation, proposed a correction plan, sent it to the director. He replied, "Great catch. Let's keep this internal." Internal meant no broader acknowledgement, no formal note in the leadership recap, just a quiet correction. Thursday evening around 7:15 p.m., I was still in the office finishing documentation. The warehouse lights had dimmed to night mode. The administrative hallway was silent. I opened my black leather notebook. Not the company system, not Slack, not email, just my notebook. I flipped back through previous entries. September timeline projections, overtime logs, resource requests declined, notes from meetings where concerns were acknowledged but not acted on, line after line of clarity. It struck me then. I had built a second version of the company. One version existed publicly, in decks, metrics, and announcements. The other existed privately, in my notes, in my memory, in the invisible corrections that kept things aligned. And the second version was more accurate. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm. I sat there, pen in hand, and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What happens if I stop compensating? Not sabotage. Not withholding basic responsibilities. Just stop shielding. Stop pre-solving before friction surfaces. Stop volunteering corrections that no one formally assigns. Stop translating executive optimism into operational feasibility. What if the system had to feel its own weight? For years, I believed that protecting the organization was loyalty, that absorbing strain was integrity, that quiet competence was a strength. But somewhere along the way, I had confused self-erasure with professionalism. I thought about my son, 8 years old, watching everything, absorbing how adults carry themselves. If he were in my position one day, respected for skill but sidelined for influence, what would I want him to do? Endure silently or recalibrate? I didn't want revenge. I didn't want anyone embarrassed. I didn't want chaos. But I no longer wanted to be the insulation, because insulation prevents heat from reaching the surface. And without heat, no one adjusts. I looked around the dim office. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had insulted me that day. No one had undermined me publicly. No one had raised their voice. The disrespect had been structural, and I had participated in it by over-functioning. That was the moment of the shift. Not outward, inward. I closed my notebook, and for the first time in years, I left something unfinished. A minor routing optimization that I normally would have cleaned up before heading home. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't critical, but I would have handled it anyway. Instead, I shut down my computer. The next morning, someone else flagged the inefficiency in Slack. Is anyone seeing this delay? I watched the thread populate. Questions, confusion, mild frustration. Normally, I would have jumped in within minutes. This time I waited. Not strategically, just observantly. It took 3 hours for the issue to be escalated properly. 4 people discussed possible causes. A temporary workaround was implemented, clumsier than mine would have been, and nothing collapsed. But something became visible. The system didn't instantly fail without me. It struggled. It hesitated. It revealed friction. And that friction was informative. I realized I had been preventing leadership from ever experiencing the full texture of operational reality. They saw polished dashboards. I saw manual overrides. They saw resolved tickets. I saw the midnight corrections behind them. That Thursday evening wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. For the first time, I understood that my silence had not been neutral. It had been a structural reinforcement. And I had a choice: continue reinforcing or step back and let reality surface. Without anger, without sabotage, without announcement, just less shielding. That was the day something shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. After that Thursday, nothing about my performance changed on paper. I arrived on time. I completed the assigned work. I attended meetings. I responded to direct questions. But something subtle had shifted in how I engaged. Before, my silence was reflexive. I held back to preserve harmony. I filled gaps instinctively because I couldn't tolerate inefficiency. Now, my silence was deliberate, and that difference mattered. In meetings, when projections were presented without operational modeling, I stopped preemptively correcting them. If someone asked any concerns, I answered honestly, but I no longer expanded beyond the scope of the question. If no one asked, I didn't volunteer. In the first few weeks, no one noticed. Why would they? From the outside, I was still steady, still competent, still responsive. But small things began surfacing more frequently. A vendor escalation took longer because I didn't personally bypass the formal ticket queue. A scheduling overlap caused mild overtime because I didn't manually rebalance assignments late at night. A cross-department misunderstanding lingered for an extra day because I didn't mediate it privately. None of it was catastrophic, but it was visible, and visibility changes perception. One afternoon, the director stopped by my desk. "Things feel a little bumpier lately," he said casually. "You noticing that?" "I've noticed the volume increase," I replied evenly. He nodded. "Yeah, just seems like we're chasing more small fires." I didn't defend. I didn't over-explain. I didn't volunteer to extinguish them faster. I simply said, "We're operating closer to capacity." That was true. For years, I had artificially expanded perceived capacity by compressing myself. Now the system was closer to its actual limits. And here's what fascinated me. My restraint was interpreted as fatigue. "Everything okay, Phil? You seem quieter than usual. Burned out?" They assumed something was wrong with me because the alternative, that I had stopped overfunctioning, didn't occur to them. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, especially when people are accustomed to your proactive correction. But this wasn't withdrawal, it was calibration. I began documenting more intentionally. Not just incidents, but patterns of assumption. When tasks were redirected toward me without discussion, when deadlines were agreed upon without operational review, when leadership summaries omitted root causes. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was clarifying architecture, understanding exactly how much of the system's stability depended on informal intervention. At home, my wife noticed something before anyone at work did. "You're less tense," she said one evening. I considered that. I was still busy, still engaged, but I wasn't carrying invisible responsibility for decisions I didn't make. That's a subtle but profound shift. When you stop internalizing outcomes beyond your authority, your nervous system changes. I slept more evenly. I stopped checking Slack compulsively at 10 p.m. I let minor inefficiencies remain, minor inefficiencies, and the organization began to feel friction, not failure, friction. In one leadership meeting, the VP of sales commented, "We need tighter operational discipline. Feels like we're slipping." I listened carefully. For years, operational discipline had been me. Now that I was operating within defined boundaries, the absence of informal reinforcement felt like a decline. The irony was almost mathematical. The more I behaved exactly within my formal job scope, the more the organization perceived instability. That's when I understood leverage. Not leverage as a threat, leverage as reality. If your extra effort is required for stability, that effort is structural, not optional. And if it's structural, it should either be acknowledged formally or removed entirely. I wasn't ready to leave yet, but I was ready to observe the system without cushioning it. And here's what became clear. The company wasn't malicious. It was comfortable with my elasticity, comfortable with my silence, comfortable with performance that exceeded the title. Once that elasticity was reduced to the normal range, the comfort wavered. But no one connected it to me directly. They saw symptoms, more escalations, more small delays, more cross-functional confusion. They didn't see the variable that had changed, and I didn't announce it, because this wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. Silence had stopped being my default. It had become my decision, and decisions, when made calmly, reshape outcomes without noise. When people imagine preparation, they picture dramatic strategy sessions, whiteboards, secret phone calls, legal consultations behind closed doors. My preparation didn't look like that. It looked like an organization, precision, documentation, and patience. Once I stopped over-functioning, I gained something I hadn't had in years: cognitive space. Instead of racing ahead to prevent problems, I allowed myself to observe them in real time. I paid attention to how long it took for issues to escalate without my intervention. Who stepped in, who hesitated, who deflected. Patterns became clearer. There were 3 types of breakdowns. First, predictable friction, the kind I used to eliminate before it surfaced. Second, structural misalignment, decisions made upstream without downstream modeling. Third, dependency gaps, processes that technically had owners but in practice were stabilized by me. The third category interested me most because those weren't written anywhere. There was no org chart box labeled Philip's unofficial corrections, but they existed. Vendor escalation shortcuts that relied on personal rapport, manual overrides in routing software I had memorized, interdepartmental understandings built through quiet mediation, historical knowledge of past failures that prevented repeated mistakes. None of that was codified, and I began asking myself a hard question. If I resigned tomorrow, how much of this would transfer cleanly? The honest answer, not much. Not because others were incompetent, but because no one had needed to learn it. I had made the complexity invisible. So I started mapping it, not in a dramatic take them down way. In a forensic way, I created private flowcharts of operational dependencies. I outlined which processes relied on informal communication versus documented policy. I noted which vendor relationships were institutional and which were personal. I didn't share these documents. They weren't leveraged in the aggressive sense. They were clear. At the same time, I reviewed my own position. Compensation, contract terms, notice period requirements, non-compete clauses. Everything was straightforward. Standard corporate language. 2 weeks notice expected, no retention agreements, no long-term incentives bind me, which was interesting. For someone described as indispensable, there were no structural mechanisms ensuring my continuity. Indispensable in conversation, replaceable in policy. That discrepancy stayed with me. I also began paying attention to language. In meetings when instability surfaced, leadership began using phrases like, "We need more discipline in operations." Why didn't we catch this earlier? We can't keep firefighting. No one said my name, but I noticed something subtle. When I no longer preemptively corrected friction, the organization assumed decline rather than dependency. They thought performance was slipping. In reality, performance was normalizing. And that normalization exposed how much invisible effort had been artificially elevating baseline stability. There was a moment that clarified everything. A large client requested an operational audit call after experiencing several minor service disruptions over a 6-week period. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to request an explanation. In previous years, I would have prepared the entire briefing deck myself. Clean metrics, contextualized variance, corrective actions are framed proactively. This time, I waited. The director asked, "Phil, can you pull together the usual overview?" I responded calmly, "Happy to provide the operational data. Who's presenting?" He paused. "Well, leadership should probably take that. Then I'll prepare raw performance metrics and root cause notes," I said. I didn't script their narrative. I didn't polish the framing. On the call, when the client asked specific operational follow-ups, there were hesitations, minor ones, but visible. Afterward, the director said privately, "That felt rougher than usual." I nodded. "We're closer to real capacity." That phrase again, closer to real capacity. What they never noticed was this. I wasn't preparing to destroy anything. I was preparing to step away cleanly, which required 2 things. First, understanding exactly how much of the system's resilience was informal. Second, ensuring that when I left, no one could claim sabotage. Everything I did remained within my job description. I responded to assigned tasks. I documented procedures accurately. I maintained professionalism. But I stopped being the unrecorded safeguard. And here's the truth. Most organizations resist. When stability depends on one person's extra effort rather than institutional design, the fragility already exists. I didn't create that fragility. I had been masking it. Over the next several weeks, I quietly updated my resume. Not aggressively, just honestly, led cross-functional operational stabilization across a multi-site logistics network. That was accurate. Designed escalation frameworks, reducing vendor resolution time. Also accurate. I began reconnecting with former colleagues. Casual conversations, industry check-ins, no dramatic job hunt announcements. I wasn't desperate to leave, but I was done being structurally invisible. The final piece of preparation was psychological. I asked myself, if they offered a promotion tomorrow, would I stay? And I surprised myself with the answer. No, because this was no longer about the title. It was about architecture. I had seen too clearly how the system functioned. And once you see the wiring behind the walls, you can pretend the paint is the structure. What they never noticed was that while they interpreted increased friction as operational fatigue, I was learning the exact shape of their dependency. Calmly, methodically, without announcing it. Leverage rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic email or a sudden scandal. It reveals itself slowly, in patterns, in dependencies, in what breaks when you stop compensating. By the time I reached this phase, I wasn't angry. That part surprises people when I tell the story privately. They assume I must have been furious, resentful, plotting. I wasn't. I was analytical. The private reveal wasn't a discovery of corruption. It wasn't some hidden illegal activity or explosive secret. It was something quieter. It was the realization that the company's operational continuity depended less on formal structure than anyone at the top understood, and that I was the bridge holding the informal structure together. The reveal came during annual budget planning. Finance circulated projections for the following fiscal year. Aggressive growth targets, efficiency expectations, headcount reductions in certain support roles to optimize cost ratios. Operations, of course, were expected to maintain performance metrics. I read the proposal carefully. On paper, it worked. In practice, it relied on assumptions that only functioned because of my historical interventions. For example, reduced administrative support hours assumed that cross-department clarifications would remain smooth. Vendor renegotiation savings assumed no increase in escalation frequency. Dock utilization targets assumed zero unplanned routing disruptions. In the past, I would have walked into the director's office with a list of corrective notes. I would have explained where the model drifted from operational reality. This time I scheduled a meeting, not to protest, to ask questions. Can you walk me through how we're accounting for escalation variance in Q3 projections? I asked calmly. Finance responded with model averages. I listened, and if escalation frequency increases by even 8 to 10% under reduced support hours, I continued. A pause. That's unlikely, someone said. I didn't argue. I didn't push emotionally. I simply documented the assumptions in my notebook. Because here was the reveal. The organization was modeling stability as if it were structural, but I knew it was behavioral. It depended on my elasticity, on my late-night interventions, on my quiet recalibrations. Without those, the projections were optimistic at best. I went back to my desk and ran a private simulation. What would performance metrics look like if I operated strictly within job description boundaries for an entire quarter? No overtime without formal approval. No proactive vendor smoothing outside the assigned scope. No undocumented cross-team mediation. No informal escalation shortcuts. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they were enough to trigger concern, enough to prompt executive review, enough to create pressure. And that's when the clarity settled fully. My presence was suppressing visible instability, not through heroics, through consistency, through silence, through overfunctioning. The private reveal wasn't that I could bring the company down. It was that the company had been underestimating how much of its operational stability was personal, not institutional. That's a very different kind of leverage. It's not explosive. It's structural, and structural leverage is calm. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was no sense of triumph. If anything, it felt sobering, because once you recognize that your silence is propping up fragility, you face a moral choice. Do you continue reinforcing something that refuses to acknowledge its architecture? Or do you step aside and let the architecture reveal itself? Around this time, a recruiter reached out through LinkedIn. Normally, I would have ignored it. This time, I responded, not enthusiastically, curiously. The conversations were measured, a comparable industry role, slightly smaller company, clearer operational authority, transparent reporting lines. More importantly, defined scope, defined responsibility, defined influence. I didn't accept immediately, but the contrast sharpened my awareness. At my current company, my value was diffuse. At this potential new company, it would be explicit. Back at work, friction continued, increasing incrementally. Nothing dramatic, just more visible. In one leadership recap, the director said, "We need to get ahead of these operational surprises." I almost smiled. They weren't surprises. They were normal variants, now unbuffered. That's when I realized the final piece of the private reveal. If I resigned abruptly during a stable quarter, they would recover. They would scramble. They would patch. But if I resigned at the precise moment when projections leaned most heavily on invisible stability, the system would stall, not collapse permanently, but pause, enough to expose dependency. And here's the key. That wouldn't be sabotage. It would be timing. I had always operated with timing in mind. Dispatch windows, vendor cutoffs, routing thresholds. Now I understand timing as leverage. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing the alignment between perception and reality. And reality was this. The system wasn't as resilient as it believed. It had been relying on a man who was no longer willing to be a silent infrastructure. Quietly, without announcement, I made my decision. Not yet to resign, but to stop shielding the consequences of neglect. And when the right moment arrived, I would step away, calmly, legally, precisely. There's a difference between imagining departure and choosing it. For months, I had been observing, documenting, recalibrating. I had taken recruiter calls. I had reviewed contracts. I had mentally stepped back from the emotional investment that once defined my identity at the company. But none of that was a decision. It was preparation. The decision came in late October during Q4 ramp-up, the heaviest operational period of our fiscal year. Historically, Q4 performance determined executive bonuses. It influenced client renewals. It shaped the narrative for the following year's strategic plan, which meant projections were aggressive and fragile. Finance had locked in reduced support hours. Sales had closed 2 additional high-volume accounts with tight delivery windows. Leadership had committed publicly to our most efficient quarter yet. I reviewed the internal modeling. It relied on perfect flow, minimal disruption, zero escalation spikes, and though no one said it aloud, my historical overperformance. The director called a meeting to confirm readiness. "Operations good?" he asked, scanning the room. In the past, I would have outlined risk mitigation steps. I would have recommended buffer staffing. I would have proposed contingency triggers. This time I answered within scope. "We're aligned with the approved headcount and vendor agreements," I said evenly. It wasn't dishonest. It just wasn't protective. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. I drew 2 columns. Stay, leave. Under stay, I wrote predictable income, familiar system, informal influence, ongoing invisibility, structural dependency without authority. Under leave, risk, adjustment period, formal operational authority at the new firm, clean break from unacknowledged leverage. System faces its true architecture. I stared at the lists longer than I expected. This wasn't about money. The new offer was competitive, but not dramatically higher. It wasn't about the title alone. It was about alignment. If I stayed, I would either return to over-functioning, because friction under Q4 pressure would trigger my instincts, or I would watch the system strain while leadership blamed discipline. If I left at a random time, the impact would be manageable. But if I left at the precise moment when projections leaned most heavily on unbuffered capacity, the organization would pause. Not because I sabotaged it, because it had never institutionalized what I had been providing. That's when I recognized the irreversible option. Resign at the last possible operational moment before Q4 lock-in. Not during chaos, not in anger, but right before execution thresholds closed. In logistics, timing matters. Miss a dispatch window by 20 minutes, and downstream routing shifts for days. I understood those windows better than anyone. The final Q4 vendor contracts were scheduled to be activated on November 3rd. After that date, contingency negotiations would be nearly impossible without penalty. If I resigned before activation, leadership could still renegotiate or adjust headcount assumptions. If I resigned after activation, but before peak volume stabilized, the system would enter Q4 under miscalculated resilience, and recalibration would be expensive. Not catastrophic, expensive, revealing. I called the recruiter that evening. "I'm ready," I said. The offer letter arrived within 48 hours. Clear reporting lines, defined scope, direct influence over vendor policy, transparent performance metrics, no diffuse invisibility. I signed. Then came the quietest part of the decision, drafting my resignation letter. No accusations, no emotional language, just gratitude for the experience, notice of departure, and final working date. I scheduled a meeting with the director for November 6th. 3 days after vendor activation, 2 weeks before the peak surge. Some would call that strategic. I called it aligned, because for years I had prevented leadership from feeling the weight of their own assumptions. Now they would feel it, not because I caused damage, but because I removed the insulation. The night before the meeting, I slept calmly. No adrenaline, no anger, just clarity. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was measured. I had stayed longer than resentment would have demanded. I had left later than comfort would have preferred. And I had chosen the irreversible option because once you see structural dependency clearly, staying silent becomes participation. And I was done participating in my own invisibility. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. There was no dramatic countdown in my head, no cinematic music, just checklists. I reviewed my employment contract one final time. 2 weeks' notice required, no restrictive non-compete beyond direct competitor solicitation. Standard confidentiality clause, which I intended to honor fully. I scheduled the resignation meeting for 9 a.m. November 6th, not the end of the day, not Friday afternoon, morning. Enough time for professionalism, not enough time for emotional theatrics. In the days leading up to it, I operated normally. I finalized documentation within my formal scope. I updated shared process folders. I ensured key metrics were accessible in dashboards, but I did not create transition guides for undocumented interventions. I didn't draft vendor relationship summaries beyond what was already systematized. If knowledge had never been formally requested or institutionalized, I wouldn't volunteer it now. Not out of spite, out of alignment. Organizations document what they consider structural. If my extra labor had never been classified as structural, it wasn't my responsibility to retroactively codify it in a rush. At home, my wife asked, "Are you nervous?" I considered it. "No," I said honestly. "I'm precise." That was the word. Precision removes fear. The morning of November 6th, I walked into the director's office carrying only a single sheet of paper. He looked up, casual. "What's up, Phil?" I closed the door gently. "I've accepted another opportunity," I said evenly. "This is my formal 2-week notice." Silence. He blinked once, then leaned back. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "When did this happen?" "I finalized the decision last week." He stared at the letter for a moment, as if it might explain more than the words on it. "You know we're heading into peak season," he said carefully. "I do." There was no accusation in his tone, just a concern. "You're critical right now." I met his eyes. "I've been critical for a long time." That wasn't sharp, it wasn't bitter, just factual. He exhaled slowly. "Is this about something we could fix?" That question hung in the air longer than he probably realized. For years, I would have interpreted that as validation. This time I answered calmly. "It's about alignment. I've accepted a role with defined operational authority." He nodded slowly. Processing. The conversation remained professional. He asked about transition timelines. I confirmed my last working day. We discussed informing HR. No raised voices, no dramatic pleas, just the quiet sound of a structural shift beginning. By 10:30 a.m., leadership knew. By noon, Slack threads were subtly different. "Loop Philip in while we still have him. Can we document that before Phil leaves? Who owns this after the 20th? Ownership. That word appeared frequently. In the past, ownership had been assumed, because I absorbed it. Now it needed an assignment. Over the next few days, I participated in transition meetings. But here's the critical distinction. I transferred formal responsibilities. I did not recreate informal ones. When asked about certain vendor nuances, I provided contact details and documented escalation pathways. When asked about recurring cross-department friction points, I referred to existing policy. If someone pressed for deeper nuance, the kind that lived in my memory, I answered honestly. That's something we've typically resolved situationally, which was true. And situational resolution by definition isn't institutional. The system began to feel tighter. Questions surfaced that hadn't been asked in years. Why doesn't this process have a documented fallback? Who approves this when timing conflicts? Why are we dependent on personal vendor relationships? I didn't answer those rhetorically. I simply continued fulfilling my role until my final day. What struck me most wasn't panic. It was delayed awareness. People were only now mapping the connections I had quietly managed for years, and the timing mattered. Vendor activation had already occurred. Q4 projections were locked. Surge volume was ramping. Adjustments now would be reactive, not preventative. But again, this wasn't sabotage. If leadership had asked for a broader structural audit months earlier, I would have participated fully. They hadn't, so the architecture remained as it was. On my final Friday, I walked through the warehouse floor one last time. The hum of forklifts, the echo of pallets shifting, the rhythm I had known intimately. I didn't feel anger. I felt relieved. Not because I had damaged anything, but because I had stopped shielding it. The consequences hadn't fully begun yet, but the insulation was gone. And systems, when exposed, respond accordingly. The first week after I left was quiet, at least from the outside. I started my new role the following Monday. Smaller organization, clear reporting structure, direct operational authority. When I asked a question, it wasn't about whether I was allowed to shape policy. It was assumed that I would. The contrast was noticeable, but I didn't dwell on it. Instead, I waited, not with anticipation, with curiosity. By Wednesday of that first week, I received my first message from a former colleague. Hey, a quick question. Do you remember how we used to handle Carrier X when they delayed Friday pickups? I read it carefully. Used to? There was already a past tense. I responded professionally. Escalation contact should be in the shared vendor file. Beyond that, the standard penalty clause applies. A few minutes later, yeah, but you had that workaround that avoided the Monday backlog. Had. I paused before replying. That was situational based on capacity and dock timing. You'll need to evaluate current volume. True. Not evasive, but no longer cushioning. By the end of that week, 2 more messages came. One from dispatch, one from finance. Both variations of the same theme. Things are feeling tighter. Of course they were. Q4 surge volume had begun. Vendor activation was locked. Reduced support hours were in effect. And the informal smoothing layer, me, was absent. The second week, the director called. His voice was professional, measured. Phil, I wanted to check in. We're seeing more escalations than projected. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied calmly. We didn't anticipate this level of variance. There it was again. Variance, a word that implies randomness. What he meant was exposure. Are you asking for clarification on past processes? I asked gently. A pause. Yes. So I clarified, within reason. I explained how I had historically monitored escalation frequency thresholds informally. How I sometimes preemptively contacted vendors before penalties triggered. How I manually rebalanced routing assignments during peak congestion. Silence on the other end. That wasn't documented, he said slowly. No, I agreed. It evolved over time, which was true. An evolution without institutional capture is fragile. He exhaled. We're trying to recreate some of it. I understand. And I did. But here's the part no one says out loud. You cannot instantly replicate years of contextual judgment under pressure. You can assign tasks. You can update process documents. But you can't transfer instinct overnight. The third week, I heard from a warehouse supervisor I'd worked closely with for years. They're adding emergency overtime, he told me, trying to catch up. Catch up to what had once been baseline. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. And that's when the consequences fully began. Not collapse, not a catastrophe. Strain, increased overtime costs, client frustration calls, internal tension between departments. Sales questioned operational discipline. Operations questioned sales forecasting. Finance questioned cost overruns. The insulation was gone. Heat reached the surface. And when heat surfaces, people look for causes. Some wondered whether I had left too abruptly. Some speculated that burnout had finally gotten to me. A few asked, quietly, why certain processes had never been formalized if they were so critical. That was the right question. But it came late. From my side, there was no satisfaction in watching this unfold, just clarity. For years, I had prevented small inefficiencies from compounding. Now they compounded naturally. Not because anyone was incompetent, but because the architecture had depended on informal reinforcement. One evening, I received an email forwarded from a client escalation thread. The client had written, "We were previously assured that operational stability was fully systematized." That line lingered with me. Fully systemized. It had been stabilized by a person. And when that person stepped away, the difference between system and individual became visible. The director called again at the end of the month. "This quarter is going to be expensive," he admitted quietly. I didn't respond with blame. I didn't remind him of past conversations. I simply said, "I hope the adjustments lead to stronger infrastructure long term." Because that was the truth. Disruption wasn't revenge, it was exposure. And exposure, while uncomfortable, is clarifying. For the first time, the company was feeling the weight I had been carrying silently. Not because I dropped it, because I put it down. By mid-December, the tone had changed. Not publicly, not in company-wide emails or client newsletters. Those remained polished, confident, strategic. But in private conversations, there was urgency. The quarter wasn't collapsing. It was bleeding. Overtime expenses had exceeded projections by nearly 18%. Vendor penalties, once rare, were now appearing weekly. Escalation response times had doubled. 2 mid-level supervisors had quietly submitted resignation notices, citing burnout. None of this was catastrophic, but together it was expensive and preventable. I received another call from the director, this one longer than the others. "We're reviewing Q4 performance," he said. "There are gaps we didn't fully anticipate." I listened. "We're realizing a lot of stability came from informal coordination," he continued carefully. "From you." There it was. Recognition. But recognition after impact feels different than recognition before it. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied evenly. "We should have institutionalized more of it," he admitted. That was the closest thing to regret I would hear. But here's the part that matters. By December, it was too late to fix the quarter. Contracts were locked. Budgets were spent. Client expectations had already been shaped by early instability. You can't rebuild infrastructure mid-surge without cost. You can only mitigate. They began implementing emergency measures. Temporary consultants were hired to audit operational flows. Additional short-term staffing approvals were granted. Vendor renegotiations were attempted at less favorable terms. Cross-department task forces were formed, all of which could have been done proactively months earlier. But without visible friction, there had been no urgency. That's the paradox of insulation. When someone absorbs instability, leaders believe the system is resilient. When insulation disappears, leaders call it decline. The truth is simpler. They are finally seeing what was always there. One of my former colleagues sent me a message late one night. "Honestly, I didn't realize how much you were smoothing until now." I read that twice. It wasn't praise. It was a realization. And realization, when it arrives late, carries weight. At my new company, things weren't perfect either. No organization is. But when operational strain appeared, it was addressed structurally. Additional resources were discussed openly. Process weaknesses were documented immediately. Authority and accountability were aligned. No one expected invisible reinforcement. And that contrast sharpened everything. Back at my former company, I heard that leadership had commissioned a full operational resilience review for Q1, which made sense, but it also meant something quietly significant. The system was finally being examined without assuming infinite elasticity. The director called one final time before year-end. "We're restructuring operations," he said, "and creating a formal escalation oversight role." I didn't comment on the irony. "That sounds like progress," I replied. "It's expensive progress," he said quietly. Yes, it was. Because when the infrastructure is built reactively, it costs more. Financially, emotionally, reputationally. He paused before ending the call. "I wish we'd understood earlier." There it was again. Not anger, not an accusation, regret. But regret doesn't rewind quarters. It doesn't refund overtime. It doesn't undo the client's doubt. The moment to institutionalize stability had been when stability appeared effortless. Instead, effortlessness had been mistaken for system design. And now, under pressure, they were paying for that assumption. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved, because this was never about watching them struggle. It was about no longer being the invisible correction layer. If I had stayed, I would have resumed smoothing under pressure. It's my instinct. And the quarter would have appeared successful. But the architecture would have remained fragile. Sometimes disruption is not destruction. It's a revelation. And by the time Q4 ended, the revelation was undeniable. Not that I had sabotaged anything, but that stability had never been fully systematized. And once the person carrying it steps away, you can't fix that overnight. The final conversation happened in January. Not in a boardroom, not in a tense emergency meeting. Over coffee. The director had asked if I'd be open to meeting while I was in town visiting family. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because there was nothing left to defend. We met at a quiet cafe near the industrial park where the warehouse stood. Neutral ground, morning light through wide windows, the kind of place where conversations don't echo. He looked tired, not defeated, just aware. After brief small talk, he leaned forward slightly. I wanted to understand something, he said. Did you time your departure intentionally? It was a fair question. I didn't flinch. Yes, I said calmly. He nodded once, absorbing that. I suspected as much. There was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity edged with regret. I didn't leave to hurt the company, I continued evenly. I left when I realized the company was relying on work that wasn't institutionalized. He sat back. You could have pushed harder for change. I did, I replied softly. For years, just quietly. That hung in the air. He looked down at his coffee for a moment. We didn't see it, he admitted. I know. That was the truth. They didn't see it because I had made it invisible. There was no shouting, no listing of grievances, no emotional unloading. Just clarity. You were holding more than we understood, he said finally. Yes, and when you stopped, I didn't stop doing my job, I said gently. I stopped doing what wasn't recognized as part of it. Silence again. That distinction mattered. I hadn't sabotaged. I hadn't withheld assigned duties. I had withdrawn excess. He exhaled slowly. We're rebuilding processes now. It's painful. I imagine it is. He gave a small, rueful smile. It would have been cheaper to promote you. Maybe. But that wasn't the point anymore. Promotion wouldn't have fixed the architecture, I said calmly. It would have formalized my authority, yes, but the dependency would still have centered on one person. He studied that. You're right, he admitted after a moment. There it was. Not validation of ego, validation of reality. We talked for another 20 minutes about the changes they were implementing, new documentation protocols, cross-training initiatives, clearer vendor accountability structures, all necessary, all elate. Before we stood to leave, he said something that stayed with me. You know, I never thought of you as quiet leverage. I almost smiled. Most leverage is quiet, I replied. We shook hands. No bitterness, no drama, no attempt to lure me back. Just mutual recognition. Walking back to my car, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vindication, release. Because the confrontation had no heat. It didn't need it. The consequences had already spoken. The quarter's numbers had spoken. The overtime reports had spoken. The client escalations had spoken. And when reality speaks clearly, you don't need volume. I didn't leave that company to prove a point. I left because I understood my role too clearly to continue playing it silently. And in that cafe across from a man who finally saw the architecture behind the stability, I realized something simple. Sometimes the strongest statement you can make is absence. It's been a year, long enough for distance to turn sharp memories into clear ones, long enough for identity to settle. When I look back, what surprises me most is not how much strain I carried. It's how deeply I tied that strain to who I believed I was. For a long time, I defined myself as the steady one, the absorber, the fixer, the reliable silence between chaos and consequence. There's dignity in that role. I don't dismiss it. But there's also danger when your value becomes synonymous with how much pressure you can withstand without speaking. At my new company, the first major operational disruption happened 3 months in. A vendor failure triggered cascading delays, the kind of scenario that used to send me into quiet, midnight correction mode. This time, I did something different. I called a meeting, not to take over, to align. We mapped the issue publicly, identified structural gaps, assigned responsibilities transparently, requested temporary support without hesitation. No one expected me to absorb it alone. No one said, "You'll handle it." They said, "How do we handle it?" That shift from individual buffering to collective architecture changed something fundamental in me. I'm still calm, still methodical, still observant, but I'm no longer invisible by design. If something isn't sustainable, I say so, early, directly, without heat. If capacity is exceeded, I don't compensate privately. I escalate structurally. If someone assumes elasticity, I clarify boundaries. Not defensively, just clearly. What I've learned is this: silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen, not imposed by expectation. Before, my silence was compliance dressed as professionalism. Now, my silence is intentional restraint. There's a difference. At home, my son once asked me why I changed jobs. I didn't explain quarterly projections or vendor activations. I told him this: because sometimes if you keep fixing everything quietly, people think nothing is broken. He thought about that for a moment. "Did you stop fixing things?" he asked. "No," I said. "I just stopped fixing things that weren't mine to fix." That's who I am now. Not less reliable, more aligned. I still carry a notebook. It's become a habit. Mapping systems, tracking patterns, observing where responsibility blurs. But now when I see structural fragility, I don't absorb it silently. I surface it calmly. The irony is this: I don't feel less loyal, I feel more honest. Because loyalty without voice becomes quiet self-erasure. And competence without boundaries becomes exploitation, even if no one intends it that way. I don't resent my former company. In many ways, they gave me the clarity I needed. They taught me how invisible architecture works, how organizations confuse stability with design, how silence can become structural. And they taught me something else. Indispensability is not power. It's a dependency. True power is alignment between responsibility and authority, between effort and acknowledgement, between stability and structure. I am still steady, still calm, still the man people describe as solid. But now, when someone says, "We couldn't run without you," I respond differently. I say, "Then let's build something that can." And that's not arrogance, it's maturity. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a triumphant ending, a moment where the company collapses, where leadership publicly apologizes, where I receive some dramatic vindication. That's not this story. The company didn't implode. It adjusted, expensively, slowly, imperfectly. And I didn't win. I realigned. That's the difference. For years, I believed strength meant endurance, that professionalism meant silence, that loyalty meant absorbing strain without complaint. But endurance without boundaries teaches people how much of you they can use. Silence without clarity trains others to mistake overextension for capacity. And loyalty without alignment turns into quiet resentment, even if you never voice it. I didn't resign to punish anyone. I resigned because I realized something simple. If a system only works because you are sacrificing invisibly, then the system doesn't work. It functions, but it doesn't work. The disruption that followed my departure wasn't revenge. It was physics. Remove structural support, and the weight redistributes. If leadership feels that redistribution for the first time, it isn't sabotage. It's exposure. The moral isn't leave dramatically. It isn't withhold effort. And it certainly isn't burn bridges. The moral is quieter than that. Document reality. Understand your leverage. Align responsibility with authority. And if alignment never comes, step away with precision, not anger. There's power in walking out loudly, but there's deeper power in walking out calmly, knowing you gave clarity before you gave consequences. Looking back, I don't regret staying as long as I did. Those years taught me architecture, not just of operations, but of human systems. How comfort dulls awareness, how silence stabilizes perception, how invisibility becomes expectation. But I also don't regret leaving when I did, because at some point, protecting a system that refuses to see its fragility becomes participation in your own diminishment. And I was done diminishing. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the steady one, the fixer, the silent stabilizer, I want to leave you with one question. Not confrontational, just reflective. Are you being valued for your role, or are you being relied on for your silence? I'm curious what you think. Have you ever stepped away and watched the system finally reveal how much you were carrying? Let me know in the comments. I read them.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ